Okay, so from all this talk we have about how we might classify organisms, we actually are able to arrive at a potential definition of what a species actually is. Typically, two organisms are considered to be a part of the same species if they can reproduce and produce viable offspring together, which basically just means offspring that can reproduce. This different definition works well for many cases, but there are, of course, a couple of exceptions to keep in mind that fall outside this umbrella of what a species actually is. Firstly, we have into the specific species hybrids, which are a very important exception that you'll probably often see. These hybrids result from the breeding of two closely related species, but the offspring are usually infertile, so they can't reproduce themselves. A classic example you'll see of this is the mule, which is a hybrid of a horse and a donkey, like shown in that picture there. These are always infertile, they can't reproduce offspring of their own. Another common example you might see is between a lion and a tiger. I can't remember what they're called, but you can feel free to search them up if you're interested. These organisms, including the mule even, are incredibly rare, and they usually only result from humans intentionally breeding them. It's very rare that they'll happen in the wild, both for the fact that these species will not try to breed generally, but also because they are a very chance occurrence. Next, we have another limitation, is that asexually reproducing organisms don't really fit into this definition because they don't really require a partner to reproduce. Since there's no interbreeding involved, the concept of producing a viable offspring isn't really applicable. So again, this falls outside of our definition. The final exception is extinct organisms because they provide a really key challenge. Obviously, we can't observe their reproductive capabilities directly. We don't know how they reproduced, even if we have a lot of evidence to suggest so. So scientists have to rely on fossil evidence and other indirect methods to determine species relationships. So there'll always be some certainty when it comes to determining species, obviously. There's always going to be exception. And especially with this definition, it obviously has a lot of shortcomings. So it's difficult to call it a really true definition. So we have a couple of different species definitions that we could potentially use instead. While that one I just discussed is probably the most common one, these definitions all have different limitations, and they're all built around a different perspective of what a species actually is. So first we have the biological perspective, which is the one we just discussed. This basically, again, just defines a species as an organism that can interbreed and produce viable offspring. It does work well for many animals, and most animals in fact, but it does fall short when it's applied to organisms that reproduce asexually, extinct species, or interspecies animals. So that moves us on to our next definition, which is the phylogenetic definition. This basically just groups species based on genetic similarities, and it allows us to classify organisms based on their evolutionary history, which, because we have DNA from extinct species, we are able to apply to both living and extinct. It does have some limitations, however. It's heavily dependent on genetic data, which isn't always available or easy to interpret compared to things like morphology. You can imagine if we have a near extinct species of bird, it's going to be really difficult to capture it, to gather data on it. So in turn, we are unable to define what species it belongs to. Because of that, we arrive at our final definition, which approaches from a morphological perspective. And this method basically is based on physical traits. So it's used for classifying fossils and organisms where genetic data isn't available. It can be sort of tricky due to the variation between or within species, like differences in color or size, which can lead to potential misclassifications, which again is a very key limitation of this approach. So clearly every method of classifying species has its downsides to it, and there's no one that is considered to be the best. Obviously certain people will prefer certain ones, but it's important to consider them all together in order to actually classify species. They're all important to the study of biodiversity. By using all these different perspectives together, scientists actually gain a more comprehensive understanding of species classification and evolutionary history.